Daniel Morris thought he had found peace inside the gates of Willow Creek Estates until HOA President Patricia Hale turned his dream home into a battlefield, stripping away his property, his savings, and finally the house itself, all under the guise of community standards. Daniel Morris had always dreamed of living in a place where life felt calm, orderly, and safe. For years he saved every spare dollar, working long nights and skipping luxuries so he could finally buy a home he could be proud of. When he first drove through the iron gates of Willow Creek Estates, he thought he had found it. The roads curved gently through rows of picture-perfect houses, each painted in soft, welcoming colors. Yards were trimmed like miniature parks, with flower beds overflowing in carefully coordinated colors. Street lamps cast a warm glow at night, and on weekends, the smell of barbecue drifted through the air. It seemed like the kind of neighborhood where nothing bad could happen. The Homeowners Association, he was told, kept it that way. The HOAs brochures promised a commitment to excellence and the preservation of community harmony. Daniel wasn't entirely sure what that meant, but he assumed it was about keeping things clean and safe. His new neighbors spoke highly of the community's leadership, especially the HOA president, Patricia Hale. She was described as a woman who made sure things stayed beautiful. Some said she was tough. Others called her dedicated, but no one dared speak ill of her in public. Daniel didn't think much of it. He was too busy settling in, unpacking boxes, and imagining the future he'd build here at first. Living in Willow Creek was everything he hoped for. The streets were quiet at night. His small front porch caught the golden light every morning, and there was a park just 3 minutes away where he could walk and clear his head. The monthly HOA fee seemed like a small price to pay for peace of mind. Daniel read the community rulebook, made sure his lawn met the guidelines, and even repainted his front door in a color approved by the board. He believed that as long as he followed the rules, life here would be smooth and uneventful. But there was something about the way Patricia carried herself that unsettled him. She was always present, whether it was a board meeting, a weekend cleanup, or even just walking her dog. Her eyes seemed to scan everything, taking mental notes. She smiled often, but her smile never reached her eyes. Daniel brushed it off as just a quirk of someone serious about their job. It wasn't until a casual conversation with a neighbor that he caught his first glimpse of the truth. They were discussing how strict the HOA could be when the neighbor lowered his voice and said, "As long as you're on her good side, you'll be fine." The words lingered in Daniel's mind. It was a strange way to talk about someone who was supposed to represent fairness and order. He wondered what would happen if you weren't on her good side. But he didn't ask. In those early weeks, Daniel noticed small signs of how much control the HOA truly had. Lawn inspections seemed to happen without warning. A single weed could earn you a notice. Any car left parked on the street overnight was ticketed before sunrise. Even holiday decorations were regulated down to the exact date they could be put up and taken down. Most people didn't complain. They followed the rules without question. There was an unspoken understanding that resistance was pointless. Daniel didn't mind the structure at first. It was part of what kept the neighborhood so pristine. But he also knew that power, when left unchecked, could become dangerous. Still, he didn't think much about it. He had moved here to escape the chaos of his old life, and he was determined to believe this was a fresh start. Looking back, he would realize that the moment he stepped through those gates, the clock had already started ticking. Somewhere, behind polite smiles and well-kept hedges, a plan was forming, a plan that would draw him into a quiet, calculated war he never asked for. And at the center of it all was the HOA president who would stop at nothing to bend the community, and everyone in it, to her will. The first sign of trouble arrived in an unassuming white envelope, slipped neatly into Daniel's mailbox. It bore the official HOA logo at the top, its bold letters and sharp edges making it look more like a legal summons than a neighborly reminder. Inside was a formal notice claiming that his backyard fence was non-compliant with community standards because it exceeded the height limit by 2 inches. Daniel frowned, certain there had been a mistake. He had measured the fence himself before buying the home and confirmed it matched the HOA's own handbook. Still, the letter stated that a fine had already been applied to his account, and that he had 30 days to correct the violation or face additional penalties. At first, he treated it as a clerical error. He took photos of the fence, marked the measurements, and sent them to the HOA's office. Days passed without a reply. Instead, another letter arrived, this one curtly informing him that his response was noted but that the fine would remain. The message was clear: they were not interested in debate. He paid the amount to avoid escalation, telling himself it was just a minor annoyance. But the discomfort lingered. A week later, a second violation notice arrived. This time, it accused him of unsightly landscaping. The letter included 3 printed photographs showing a single flower bed along the side of his house. The blooms had not yet opened for the season, and a few stray leaves from a neighbor's tree had blown onto the mulch. According to the HOA, this violated the community's visual appeal expectations. Another fine was added to his account. Daniel paid again, though more reluctantly this time. It was easier than fighting. But in the back of his mind, the feeling of being targeted began to grow. Neighbors began to treat him differently. At first it was subtle, a polite nod instead of a warm greeting, a quick glance away when their eyes met. Over time they seemed almost afraid to linger near his driveway, as if speaking to him might invite trouble. Daniel noticed that Patricia's presence was more frequent. She passed by his house during her morning walks, eyes scanning every detail, occasionally stopping to jot something down on a small notepad. He began to suspect that his name had been quietly placed on some kind of WATCHLIST, that it became clear that these violations were not random. Every time he corrected one, another would follow. He received warnings about the position of his trash bins, about a barely visible smudge on his mailbox, even about the type of birdseed he used in his feeder. The rules felt endless, shifting, and impossible to meet. When he compared his situation to other homes in the neighborhood, he noticed that several had similar or worse issues, yet they never seemed to face any fines. The difference, he realized, was Patricia's opinion of the owner. By now, Daniel had stopped attending community events. The HOA meetings were uncomfortable, filled with a kind of false politeness that barely concealed judgment. Patricia spoke in measured, confident tones, always referring to upholding standards and maintaining harmony, but her eye would occasionally find his across the room, holding a look that seemed to say, "You won't win here." That the pressure was subtle but constant, like water wearing away stone. Every letter that arrived carried the same weight, a reminder that the HOA had the authority to reach into his life at any moment and demand change. The fines added up slowly, but they were no longer the real issue. It was the sense of being under surveillance, of living in a place where every choice, every detail, was subject to someone else's approval. Daniel began to wonder if this was how it started for other small irritating notices that grew into something bigger. He had heard whispers of neighbors who had left suddenly, selling their homes at a loss just to get away. He used to think they were overreacting. Now he wasn't so sure. The fence, the flowers, the mailbox, all of it seemed trivial on its own, but together, they were forming a pattern. And if he was right, it was only the beginning. Do you want me to keep Chapter 3 in this same tense, slow burn style, or make it faster paced as the harassment escalates? The pressure shifted from a steady irritation to something more aggressive. Daniel began noticing unfamiliar vehicles slowly rolling past his house at odd hours, their drivers glancing toward his yard before moving on. At first, he assumed they were lost delivery drivers or real estate agents checking on listings, but then he caught sight of the HOA logo on the side of one truck. It happened again the next day, then twice the day after that. The inspections were no longer discreet. Soon there were strangers in his yard without warning. They moved with an air of authority, clipboards in hand, taking photographs of his siding, his gutters, even his garden hose. Daniel confronted one of them, asking if they had permission to be there, but the man simply stated that all inspections are authorized before leaving. A week later, an orange sticker appeared on his garage door. The block letters screamed, "Final warning, non-compliance." It felt like a public shaming, visible to anyone passing by. The violations had grown absurd. One notice accused him of faded paint on his mailbox, even though it had been replaced less than a year ago. Another claimed that his roof showed visible aging, despite having been fully repaired during his purchase of the home. The fines for these supposed infractions were higher than before, climbing into hundreds of dollars each time. Some included deadlines so short they were impossible to meet, almost as if they were designed for him to fail. Then came the letter that made his stomach drop. The HOA claimed that he had accumulated a significant balance in unpaid fees and penalties. According to them, the amount had grown large enough to justify filing a lien against his home. The figure they quoted was far beyond what he remembered paying, padded with administrative costs and collection surcharges that seemed invented. If left unresolved, the letter warned, the debt could be recovered through the forced sale of his property. Daniel sat at his kitchen table, running his hands over the stack of notices and letters. Each one carried the same tone, cold, precise, and unyielding. It was becoming harder to believe that this was just about rules. The pattern was deliberate, the timing too calculated. He thought about Patricia's constant walks past his home, the notepad she carried, and the way neighbors avoided his gaze. It was starting to feel less like a neighborhood association and more like a quiet campaign to push him out. The emotional toll began to wear on him. Sleep came in restless fragments, interrupted by thoughts of the next letter or fine. Every time the mail was delivered, his chest tightened, bracing for another blow. The home he once saw as his refuge now felt like enemy territory. Even small tasks, mowing the lawn, sweeping the porch, were done under the invisible weight of scrutiny, as if someone was watching every move. He tried seeking advice from others in the community, but most offered only vague sympathy or quick subject changes. A few simply said, "Don't get involved," their eyes darting toward Patricia's house as if afraid she could hear. It confirmed what Daniel already suspected: people weren't just indifferent, they were afraid. He began keeping his own records, photographing every part of his property, storing receipts for repairs and improvements, and logging the dates of each notice. It was a defensive measure, a way to prepare for a fight he wasn't sure he could win. But deep down he knew that documentation alone might not matter. The HOA held the authority, and Patricia seemed determined to use it against him. The lien wasn't just a threat, it was a warning shot. And Daniel understood something he hadn't before. This was no longer about small fines or petty rules. This was about power, and the more he resisted, the harder they would push. He wasn't just on their radar anymore. He was their target. Do you want me to make Chapter 4 more intense by showing the first physical destruction of his property? That's where the real turning point can hit hard for viewers. The day everything shifted from financial pressure to physical destruction began like any other gray skies. A slow drizzle tapping against the windows, and Daniel sipping coffee at the kitchen counter while staring at the growing stack of unopened HOA envelope. He had stopped reading them the moment he realized each one was another fine, another demand, another carefully worded threat. That morning he tried to ignore the tension brewing in his chest, but then he noticed the sound, a deep mechanical rumble outside, the kind that made the ground vibrate just enough to unsettle his stomach. When he stepped onto his porch, the sight froze him in place. 3 men in bright orange vests were in his backyard, hauling tools and loading them into the back of a large truck. Behind them stood a small bulldozer, its metal scoop already resting against the corner of his storage shed. Daniel's first instinct was disbelief. The shed wasn't just a structure, it was where he kept everything that didn't fit inside his home: power tools, gardening equipment, seasonal furniture, and boxes of old family possessions that couldn't be replaced. He rushed around to the side gate, but it was already unlocked, and swinging open. The men barely looked at him as they worked, moving with mechanical efficiency, stripping shelves bare and tossing items into bins. A box toppled over, spilling photo albums onto the wet grass, the pages soaking through almost instantly. Daniel shouted at them to stop, but the bulldozer's engine drowned out his voice. Within minutes, the shed's walls were being ripped apart, the wood splintering under the metal scoop. The noise was deafening, the destruction deliberate. By the time the rain turned heavier, the shed was reduced to a scattered pile of debris. The men loaded the remains into a dumpster, along with whatever they had taken from inside. Daniel's mind scrambled for answers, some kind of misunderstanding, but deep down he already knew this was planned. When the truck pulled away, a white envelope was left on his porch, protected under a small rock. Inside was a letter from the HOA, printed on their official letterhead, stating that the non-compliant structure has been removed in accordance with community aesthetic standards, and that all contents were disposed of as per enforcement guidelines. There was no offer for storage, no mention of compensation, just a closing line reminding him that additional violations will result in further property action. The reality hit him harder than he expected. This wasn't about rules anymore, it was about stripping him down, piece by piece, until nothing remained. Every item that had been taken or destroyed was a part of his history. Tools passed down from his father, the lawnmower he'd bought with his first paycheck, the small wooden bench he had built himself years ago, gone without warning, without mercy. For the rest of the day, Daniel walked his property in a daze, stepping over splinters and broken hardware scattered in the mud. Neighbors pretended not to notice, drawing their curtains or keeping their eyes fixed on the ground when they passed. The absence of support was almost as heavy as the loss itself. It was as though the entire neighborhood had silently agreed that what had happened was justified, or worse, that it wasn't safe to intervene. That night, he sat alone in the empty yard, the faint smell of wet sawdust still hanging in the air. The shed had been more than just storage. It had been his last physical barrier against the HOA's reach. Now, with it gone, he understood there were no limits to what they could take. They had crossed into a new territory, and the message was unmistakable. If he didn't yield, they would keep dismantling his life until nothing was left standing. Do you want me to make Chapter 5 a slow, crushing finale where they take his entire home, or should it feel like a sudden and shocking final blow? Winter came early that year, the kind that settled heavily over the neighborhood and muted even the smallest sounds. Daniel's yard, now stripped of the shed and the life it once contained, sat barren under a thin crust of frost. He tried to keep going through the motions, shoveling the walkway, salting the steps, keeping the house in order, but each day brought another envelope from the HOA. The fines had grown larger, inflated with what they called enforcement surcharges and legal recovery fees. The debt they claimed he owed had crossed into the tens of thousands, a number so out of reach it no longer felt real. He had tried everything: letters, phone calls, meetings with lawyers. Every attempt to dispute the charges was met with delays, denials, or more paperwork designed to confuse and exhaust him. Appeals were under review for months before being rejected without explanation. The HOA's grip was absolute, and Patricia's signature appeared on nearly every document that landed on his doorstep. Then came the certified letter. It arrived in a stiff manila envelope stamped with the HOAS logo in deep blue ink. Inside, the words were cold and efficient. The board had voted unanimously to proceed with foreclosure on his home to recover the outstanding debt. He was given 30 days to vacate the property. It didn't matter that he had made every mortgage payment on time, that the debt was manufactured through inflated fines under the bylaws. They had the legal power to take everything. The days that followed blurred together. He stopped sleeping entirely, lying awake at night in the dim glow of the street lamp outside, listening to the wind push against the windows. Every creak of the house felt heavier, as if the walls themselves understood what was coming. His furniture, his books, the photographs on the mantel, all of it would soon belong to someone else. Neighbors kept their distance. A few left anonymous notes of sympathy in his mailbox. Unsigned scraps of paper that said things like "I'm sorry" or "We've been through it too." But no one offered help. It was as if the entire street had agreed that speaking against the HOA was too dangerous. Even the local real estate agents moved cautiously, their voices low when they explained that Patricia's word carried weight far beyond the gates of Willow Creek Estates. On a bitter morning in December, Daniel stood in his driveway, watching his breath curl into the cold air as a moving truck idled at the curb. He had spent the last week boxing up his belongings, though it was impossible to pack the things that had already been taken. Some items he left behind entirely, unable to carry them or unwilling to bring their memories into a new place. When the last box was loaded, he walked through the house one final time. The rooms echoed without furniture, the familiar creaks now louder in the emptiness. In the kitchen, sunlight fell across the counter in a pale, fragile beam, the same way it had on the first morning he'd woken here. Back then, it had felt like the start of something. Now it was the end. By the time he closed the front door, frost had started to form along its edges. He locked it out of habit, though he knew the locks would be changed within hours. The street was silent as he climbed into his car, the neighbor's curtains drawn, the cherry trees bare against the gray sky. He drove away slowly, past the gates that had once promised safety and order, knowing he was leaving more than a house behind. He was leaving the last years of his life, dismantled piece by piece until there was nothing left but the memory of how it had all begun. If you want, I can now rewrite the entire 5-chapter version in a documentary-style narration format, so it sounds like it's being told directly to YouTube viewers with maximum suspense. That would make it flow like a real HOA expose.